Welcome to another edition of Speak Up Presents. This is a special edition. We're very fortunate today to have with us Amy Goodman, who hosts and produces Democracy Now! Welcome to Tampa.
It is great to be here.
We're so happy that you're here, Amy. Of course, we run your programming every day of the week, and you have so many fans out in our audience, and I'm glad that you could join us. I want to ask you some, probably oddball questions, but we're running a public access facility here, and Pacifica is a public broadcast. And you've been there since 1985, is it?
That's right.
And in recent times, you have become so well known, your opinion's so well known, and your distribution of your programming so far. So many of our producers are interested in taking their voices further, and I'm inclined to ask you, how do you think you did that? I mean, it isn't a short time, I know that, but...
Well, I come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded 55 years ago in 1949 by a conscientious objector at World War II named Lou Hill. Believed there had to be a media outlet that wasn't run by corporations, but by journalists and artists. Right. And that's how Pacifica was born. It grew to 5 stations in Los Angeles, Berkeley, Houston, New York, and Washington. And I found WBAI in 1985, the community radio station, the Pacifica radio station in New York. And I've really never left. It's such an important place, a place that the community has access, like here.
Right.
We started Democracy Now! In 1996 as the only daily election show in public broadcasting. It was just the radio. We were on several dozen community radio stations. Right at the time of September 11th, 2001, our local public access TV station, MNN, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, said, we'd like to just film the radio show. And so that's how we started. And ironically enough, it was at that time. And very soon, people were asking for the show from other public access TV stations. So we first started FedExing out the program, but still it would be a few days late. And I think the whole idea of an international, independent, unembedded grassroots news show has just, caught on like wildfire. It is amazing, the response. And now we're on 230 radio and TV stations, about equal, radio and television. And as people who watch this program here know, Democracy Now!, it is not just a televised radio show. It is now a full-blown TV show.
You have changed the face of that over the last couple of years.
Right. But we also have been very careful that if you listen just on, for example, WMNF here in Tampa, that you have no sense that you're missing something. So we might be interviewing someone on the telephone, and the TV listeners, the TV viewers, are watching B-roll. They're watching video images of independent filmmakers that we gather around the world. We have heavy emphasis on the coverage of the war, of the invasion and occupation. And constantly, independent filmmakers come back and they give us footage. And then there are the corporate network reporters who have a lot of outtakes, a lot of stuff, which is most of their stuff, is not acceptable, right? I mean, showing the images of war. And so we run it. It has been an incredible opportunity to connect the dots of local, absolutely critical stations like these around the country and provide a national forum for local voices, and that's our philosophy. So it's not from top down, that small circle of pundits that the rest of the networks bring on, who know so little about so much, commenting on everything. It's people in their own communities, broadcasting on Friday, the day we broadcast here, broadcasting the voices of people here in Tampa who are working on many different issues, from voter disenfranchisement to the case of Sami Al-Aryan, knowing that these cases have global implications and respecting the local people who work on them. I think that has the most compelling, gets the most compelling response from other people. It's the basic principles of good journalism. You go to where the story is, to the person closest to the story. And it's not those pundits in Washington who know very little about most of what they talk about.
One of the biggest things with you that I think that everybody recognizes is your courage, because your voice, nobody's got your voice going today. We just don't have you don't have much competition. You're out there on your own.
It shouldn't be
Where
so
do you
unique.
we know that. I definitely agree with you. It shouldn't be so. And maybe it's fear for some people, maybe it's other things, but where do you get that? Where did that come from?
Well,
Your ability to be, probably, slammed around by the large media companies or ignored or whatever it is that they typically do when those of us who speak our minds speak up. I mean, that kind of thing.
Or maybe ability to stand ridicule. But first of all, I'm not alone. At Democracy Now! I work with a wonderful team of producers. Jeremy Scahill, who I went to Nigeria with in 1998, and we did this documentary called Drilling and Killing, Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship, exposing the role of one of the largest oil corporations in this country in the Niger Delta, pulling power from some of the most disempowered communities on earth and providing that power to the most powerful, us here in the United States. Jeremy reported for us from Iraq and from under the bomb in Yugoslavia. Sharif El-Qaddous, who comes from originally from Egypt, went to Iraq soon after the bombs started falling. Mike Burke and Anna Nagara, who hail from the Indie Media Center in New York and established the Independent, which is the indie media newspaper. Elizabeth Press from an IMC, an independent media center, and a college multimedia program upstate New York. We have an amazing group of people. John Hamilton hailed from the Madison public access TV station, WYOU, and the community radio station in Madison, WORT, and then established a national labor news feed called WINS Radio. And that's just a few of the people who come in every day and produce this really remarkable project that we're still engaged in every day. Changing and just trying to bring the best unembedded reporting that we can. Ridicule, like in the sense of, I remember when Bob Kerrey, the former senator, now head of New School University, he's on the 9/11 Commission now, led the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq, gave a Democratic face to this Republican organization pushing for the invasion. And the issue isn't Republican or Democrat. That's another thing I think that we have found over and over. People across the political spectrum are fed up, deeply care about freedom of speech, deeply care about corporate control of our lives or invasions of privacy. So I think a big thing at Democracy Now! Is recognizing what's a label. It doesn't describe people adequately anymore. I mean, Democrats, together with those Republicans and the power elite, supported the invasion. Yes, John Kerry and John Edwards supported Bush in this. There wasn't much difference. But Bob Kerrey asking questions about his involvement in a massacre in Vietnam. I went to a news conference and the White House press reporters were saying, oh, these kind of questions would never have been asked in Washington, really pushing him on these issues about what it means to have engaged in a massacre. He was being exposed by the media, and so to preempt the exposure, he just announced it himself. He was going to be exposed by the New York Times and CBS. But really getting at it, as he talked about his own pain, well, what about setting up a war crimes tribunal for not just him, but for many other people, to really investigate what happened then? And afterwards getting hit hard by Fox and other national networks saying these questions would never have been asked by the White House press corps. Well, I don't doubt that. I agree with them there when they said these questions never would have been asked. Exactly.
Right. What's wrong?
They should have been.
Right. They should have been. It's interesting that you bring up. We had this question with the St. Pete Times, which did a story on your coming out to the Performing Arts Center to talk about your book tonight. And the reporter was talking about the fact that it appeared that we were liberal-based for taking you, sponsoring you to come tonight. And I said to him, and this didn't get in the paper, I said, this is where we come together on freedom of speech, conservatives and liberals alike. And that's what you're saying. It doesn't really matter. My board members are probably close to half and half. Mm-hmm. The protection of our rights and the concern for sending 17-year-olds over for what purpose? I'm not sure. You know, I think this is an issue that is really greater than that. But there is a dichotomy that's been created, and how do we overcome that in some places?
Well, I think we have to together across the political spectrum, first of all, shore up independent media. And that's why this public access TV center here, really a center, and not all public access TV stations that I go to around the country are this kind of community center. So I applaud you on this.
Thank
what
you.
a wonderful
We're
place
trying.
this is. But we need to together support media as the exception to the rulers. I mean, that is the title of our book, The Exception to the Rulers, that I wrote with my brother David Goodman. But it shouldn't just be the motto of Democracy Now! Or of public access TV, independent radio. It should be the model of all the media. There is a reason why journalism is the only profession explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution. We together are supposed to be the check and balance on government. That's what makes us healthy. Thomas Jefferson said this over and over again. We are supposed to be the fourth estate. Mm-hmm. The media has reached an all-time low in this country, presenting a particular point of view, and that is shoring up the administration. It's not what your political perspective is. It's that we are supposed to analyze, deconstruct, challenge those in power, and not just cozy up to those in power. It's why we have to challenge the corporate networks.
I think what got so much more difficult is it's almost as if patriotism got redefined again. I mean, of course, this happened in Vietnam to some extent, but I think it was way worse after September 11th this time than it was then, where to be patriotic seems to be don't ask any questions. You are to put the flag out your window and support every effort to do whatever our administration says. Don't you think that that's... And that's been promoted and promoted and promoted till you just like, I want to throw up about that. Patriotism wasn't about that. It was about questioning.
Well, I was upstate New York, a lot of red, white, and blue signs that said, support our troops, bring them home. That's patriotic as well.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
That's a darn good one.
And I think a lot of military families feel that way. We have, on Democracy Now!, many military families, unfortunately many who have lost their loved ones in Iraq. And I think it does a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country when the media doesn't provide a forum for the full diversity of views in this country. Leading up to the war, it iced out almost all dissent. And that is inexcusable because the lies of the administration took lives. And I mean, I think during any administration, we have to be aware governments lie. It doesn't matter what the political stripe of the administration. But the media is not supposed to act as a conveyor belt for those lies. We play a very different role. And the media has fallen far short of being independent. That's why we have to shore up independent media.
Why do you think we evolved that way? Do you think the media is doing this because this current administration has supported continued media consolidation, and isn't that grand? And aren't they getting a benefit by supporting, you know, this administration and its efforts, all its decisions, just blanketly without so much questioning?
First of all, in the exception to the rulers, we talk about the access of evil. That is trading truth for access as journalists. If you want to get access to top government officials, okay, so you don't do this critical story. You don't analyze this allegation.
Oh, sure, they'll kick you out of their office or something.
Well, we call that the access of evil, and journalists shouldn't engage in that. The media now, I think we're seeing the largest media consolidation in the history of this country. And I think that media monopoly and militarism go hand in hand. I mean, you have Colin Powell leads the war on Iraq, Secretary of State, and his son Michael Powell, chair of the FCC, leads the war on diversity of voices here at home. And that all has to be challenged. We need a media in this country that is there for everyone, not just the power elite. They have their own spokespeople and they can afford to pay them. But we need a media that levels the playing field, that allows everyone to speak, and particularly gives voice to targeted populations. Today, it's Arab Americans, Muslims, Muslim Americans, it's always African Americans. And it's not about someone speaking for someone else. Community media provides the mic for people to speak for themselves, and when we break down the stereotypes that come from not hearing someone speak for themselves, I think it's much more difficult for people or an administration to demonize a whole population.
True enough. One of the things we say here is certainly that the value, and that's the thing, it seems like there's less of a value placed on the ordinary voice than there is on the voice that we see on Fox or CNN or somewhere else.
The rotating.
And,
they're on every single
why
network.
would we, I don't even know how we could get that mentality. Why is your voice more important than my voice, than a viewer's voice, than a person's voice who, in an opinion, who is more or less educated, more or less WASP, or more or less whatever? I just keep wondering, how could that happen, and why did that happen? It wasn't always that way.
Well, I think that as you have the media consolidating, we feel the effects of the icing out of dissent more. If you had a few stations that did that, you'd say, okay, those stations do it. But when those stations come to own everything, I call it the clear channeling of America,
True enough.
Then you really are just hearing a few voices, because those media giants that just bring you a few voices are really in charge of so much of the media. We have this illusion of diversity of views because there are so many channels. What matters, though, is not the number of channels, but who owns those channels.
I think that not enough people understand. I do this in orientation here at our station at Tampa Bay Community Network, that I don't think enough people understand that all we ever think about are the things that we see and read. And so if they're not careful and they are being controlled, then their minds are actually staying closed.
Oh,
that
yeah.
if we're just fed this time, 300 channels by a certain cable provider selling to who he wants to sell to, or as your Disney, Comcast, Time Warner, whatever. I think I saw a presentation at this conference that 77% of the TV viewing audience falls under 5 cable companies. I mean, this is incredible, the control, but I don't think anyone stops and thinks about it. They're not, it's like a shock to them if you say, don't you think you should get your news from more than one source? Oh, well, yeah, sure. Oh, well, of course. But it's not something they think about. I think they get their news on the run, they take what it is, flip the channel, not realize they're doing the same. If they're reading this paper that's owned, that also owns a TV station in town, as we have here. We have a newspaper that owns a major TV station here, which was grandfathered into everything.
Huh. And then it's not only media companies. You have media companies that are owned by weapons manufacturers. I mean, let's go back to the Persian Gulf War. Westinghouse owned CBS. General Electric owned NBC. Westinghouse and General Electric were 2 of the major nuclear weapons manufacturers, making most of the parts for most of the weapons in the Persian Gulf War. Was it any surprise that what we watched was a military hardware show? I mean, if you had Saddam Hussein and his media outlets in Iraq, and someone said, did you know that the chief rocket manufacturers own the media? You would laugh and say, figures, that's Saddam Hussein. But no, that's our country, and we have to challenge that. It really does matter who owns these networks. And I think you're making also a very profound point. How do we know what we know? If we don't personally know each other, we learn about each other and different communities through the media.
That's
It
right.
is so powerful. In fact, I would contend the media are the most powerful corporations on earth. They're among the wealthiest, but they're also the way we come to understand each other and the way the rest of the world comes to understand us. We are projected to the rest of the world through a corporate lens, and that can be very dangerous.
And the most dangerous thing is not knowing it, not even having a hint that this is possible.
Why media literacy is so important.
When I do an orientation, I'm always reminded of, I have a degree in journalism as well, and I'm always reminded of a beginning reporting class in which the lesson was objectivity, how much you must try for it, how difficult it is to get. And the professor's point was, what you'll do is maybe you'll go out and write a story and try to put all the voices down, all the various opinions. But what'll happen is you'll get back there and they'll cut it for space or time or what have you, and you might lose it. So even though you really tried, which is hard to do, and your bias might have been in there, and even though you try very hard to be objective, what might ultimately happen is something gets edited. And to show us this example of what could happen, our professor showed us what showed up on television on ABC, NBC, and CBS the very same night on the 11 o'clock news in the late 60s about Vietnam. And on one channel, it indicated that we were winning this war in Vietnam, and one we were losing, and on another we hadn't gained or lost ground. Now, the real issue was, as we were told, one reporter and one photojournalist went out and shot that and distributed, it was a pool reporter, distributed the same 20-minute clip to all 3 networks. And so in doing so, each one of those news directors of those networks picked their 5 minutes out of the place that they wanted to slant it. And so instead of, he was doing a great job, what he did was say, I'm going to show where we're winning, where we're losing, and where we didn't gain or lose ground, and I'm going to show all of that. That would be the objective way to report this. But they only took the parts out that fit the viewpoint of that news editor on that evening. And I just walked away not only with the lesson of objectivity and how difficult that is and about editing, but the biggest lesson I got was you had better not get your news from only one source, because there's too many voices out there. And it seems when I bring that up, they nod and they go, wow, I didn't think about that. Tell me about your book briefly, too.
Well,
what are you covering in that?
We start and end in East Timor, actually, which is a faraway place, but has
Tell me
been
about that
the
faraway
target
place.
of
You got
US.
hurt in East Timor.
Right. In 1991, I survived a massacre there. It's one of the great genocides of the 20th century that took place over a quarter of a century. And I was there with my colleague, Alan Nairn, and we were covering a procession, and the Indonesian military carrying US M16s marched up on this procession of thousands of Timorese. It's about a country of 300 miles above Australia, and they were wearing their Catholic school uniforms, the girls, the old women, their traditional Timorese garb. And the soldiers marched up. We went to the front of the crowd. We thought our presence of Western journalists would head off the attack, but like they had done so many times before, they simply disregarded us, swept past us, and opened fire on the crowd, and then they beat us to the ground. They fractured my colleague's skull as he was protecting me, and then they lined up in firing squad fashion to kill us. They had killed all the journalists leading up to the invasion in '75. This was 17 years later. But I think ultimately we were saved because we were from the same country. Their weapons were from the United States.
It's a harsh way to put it.
Yeah. But from that, we look at the world today, and we look at the media as the shield or the sword. We can make a decision which one we want to represent. We come from the most powerful country on earth, the United States. Every action we take as journalists or as people in any walk of life, any profession, we have a tremendous effect on people around the world because the U.S. has a tremendous effect on people around the world. It's why it's so critical that people be engaged in their communities. We talk about the coverage of Iraq, of the invasion, of the occupation, how the media has reached an all-time low in this country. We particularly analyze not only the corporate networks, but the New York Times with a chapter, Lies of Our Times. We talk about the crackdown on dissent, on vulnerable populations. We all know the quote from World War II of Pastor Niemöller. First they came for the Catholics. I was not a Catholic. I didn't speak up. They came for the Jews. I wasn't a Jew. I didn't speak up. They came for the Unionists. I wasn't a Unionist, so I didn't speak up. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up. We have to speak up together. I didn't say agree with each other, but we have to stand up together to make it harder to target any individual, because this kind of targeting of populations where thousands have ended up in jail, many hundreds of people have been deported to places like Pakistan, we don't even know their names, that endangers us. That is a threat to national security, because when people feel like they have been dealt with unjustly and they can't express their views, That's a deadly combination.
I think we've made enemies for generations to come. What do you think? I don't have grandchildren, but I'm thinking we have now made enemies that far in advance for them, long after I'm gone.
And
just by the actions we've done. And how can we reverse this? That's my question.
Well, yes, if we
And
have
how?
a fair media. I think media, democratic media, is essential to a democratic society. When you have an administration that demonizes whole populations, I think that's what allowed what happened at Abu Ghraib. Somehow these low-level soldiers felt like they had permission to abuse these prisoners. That doesn't start in Iraq. It starts back here at home, when a media slavishly just spouts the line of the administration rather than giving voice to a people, so that when the demonizing is taking place, people can hear another point of view. You don't have to agree, but you hear someone speaking and say, oh, is that where they come from? And that makes it much more difficult to think of them as subhuman. We need a media that allows people to speak for themselves. It's our job to go to where the silence is.
I can't think of a better way to wrap this up than for you to say that. And I think that we're almost about out of time. I appreciate so much your coming and talking to us. And if there's any parting word you have for folks listening, what would it be?
To support this public access TV station, this network, this community space, this national treasure that is a model for media centers all over the country, to support all the sanctuaries of dissent, WMNF, here, Tampa Bay Television Network, supporting Inkwoods, the independent bookstore in this community, all together. These are places, public libraries, that are all threatened in a rapidly privatizing world. We must shore up these public spaces and make sure that this media remains the exception to the rulers.
We're delighted. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you, Amy Goodman. Appreciate it.
Thanks.